This is TWiT.
A little brown liquor education, please.
Are you ready for the next phase of the story, friend?
Ready?
So, going back to the beginning, we talked about growing barley and malting and milling and mashing. So where we left off was in the mash tun, right? We have now taken the grist and run water through it, and we've made wort, the same stuff you'd make for beer. You've now extracted sugars using warm water, and now it's time to mix the yeast in. We're going to ferment. And so the water extraction process, fairly high temperature, comparatively speaking. We're talking 60 to even as high as 90 degrees centigrade. So that's, 130 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit in the measurements of the oppressors. But yeast can't tolerate that kind of heat. Get with the rest of the world, friends.
Yes.
Celsius is your friend. So yeast is going to consume these sugars and release alcohol and carbon dioxide in the process. So this is where the alcohol comes into the equation. And yeast, the typical yeast that they use is optimized for 34 degrees centigrade. That's when it'll be the most productive. That's about 93 degrees Fahrenheit. Above 35 degrees centigrade, the yeast starts to die. So you don't want to be that hot. So first problem with your worts, you got to cool it down. They have heat exchangers to do this. And then they will immediately introduce the yeast into the wort as it's pumped into the washback. And we'll talk about washbacks in a bit.
As opposed to backwash, which we don't
As opposed to backwash, which you don't want near as much. It's interesting to think that we've been making whiskey for hundreds of years, and yet we've only just started. Understanding yeast is relatively new. So when you talk about original whiskeys back pre-1800s, the yeast mostly came from beer. So we'd long ago learned that lambic yeasts available in the air would make alcohol out of grain, malted grain, to be turned into beer. And the process that was used in the pre-1800s for making whiskey is they would stir the wort with larch sticks, branches of the larch tree. Huh. And the yeast would tend to stick to these sticks and survive. So as they moistened it again, stirring again, they'd propagate the yeast while not knowing what yeast was. Oh, now, the yeast would propagate enough.
But they didn't know why.
Exactly. In fact, they thought that yeast was an unfortunate byproduct, not recognizing it was actually the thing that was making the alcohol. Now, the first scientific evidence that yeast was the part of the process actually comes from Louis Pasteur. So pasteurization, like all of that stuff, it was Louis Pasteur in 1879 who said yeast is why fermentation exists and started identifying strains of yeast. And in fact, shortly after that, we have sort of the base yeast that's used, what they call distiller's yeast, which is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. By the 1930s, there were companies working in Scotland that created a hybrid between cerevisiae and another kind of yeast called Saccharomyces diastaticus. That company would eventually become Diageo. The names actually share. We'll talk about the companies that own distilleries later, because that's a long conversation. And that particular hybrid, what they call DCL-M strain, was so popular that for a period, for 50-something years, up until at least 2003, it was the mandated yeast. This is the yeast that all Scottish distilleries would use, and in fact, many still do, although we now have more modern, more efficient yeasts that are starting to become more popular, like MX and Mari, and so forth. The yeast is a living creature. It's a large single cell, and it consumes sugars, and it's kept alive. It's live in a liquid form, and it's typically stored in a liquid form and used steadily. It used to be common for distilleries to produce their own yeast at scale. They don't anymore. There are specialists in all of this. But the concentrated yeast paste, or yeast cream as they call it, is actually mixed with the wort as it's pumped into the washback. And this is a kind of a race.
That was a fairly disgusting sentence that you just issued.
I know. I had a stomach issue the other night that was just like this.
I mixed wort and yeast cream into the washback.
Yeah.
Oh my cow.
Don't get your wort on my washback.
Yes.
Ooh. Okay. Go
Now,
ahead.
and then fermentation takes off immediately. Within hours, you have a concentration of alcohol. Now, when I've tours of distilleries and gotten a chance to talk to the folks that run the fermentation, and then because these very, very Scottish people, they're often difficult to understand. Most fermentation runs for days, in fact, and they'll study the weather very closely before they start a fermentation batch because the temperature matters. They don't want to overheat and they don't want it to be too cold. It's kind of a minimum of 48 hours of fermentation. The average is more like 60 to 75 hours, although some distilleries prefer much longer fermentations up to over 100 hours. The sort of general rule is that short fermentations gives you more grain flavors and long fermentations create more complex flavors, as they call it. The fermentation process is rather vigorous. The concentration is high. They have a high specific gravity. And so the yeast is so active when you see these washbacks in action, and they're 25,000 to 40,000 liters. They're big. Okay, back to the measurements of the pressures, like 9,000 gallons. And the yeast is so active, it almost looks like the liquid is boiling. Like it's that much energy. And there's a lot of carbon dioxide being released. In fact, it's dangerous to get your head over top of a washback because you can literally knock yourself out and fall into the mixture, which you can't swim in because the release of carbon dioxide is so rapid, you will sink to the bottom and be stuck there.
Oh, Lord.
So, and they keep lids over these washbacks for that reason, try and keep you safe. It also generates a lot of foam. And so they have a device that sits on top of it that stirs they call it a switcher, to stir the foam to stop it from overflowing the washback. Traditionally, washbacks were made of larch, the same sticks they used to stir in the first place.
Wow.
Wait, did you say larch?
The larch, yes.
Wood, yeah.
I have a larch
wood,
tree in my
European
front yard.
You should be making whiskey, my friend.
You could be
It
making
is
whiskey.
the ugliest tree on earth.
All the more reason
neither
to,
a pine nor a deciduous. It is a mess.
now, all the more reason to cut it down, slice it into planks, and make a washback from it.
Interesting.
Now, later generations of washbacks use Douglas fir, Oregon pine, New World trees. They're generally looking for tight grain, no knots, long planks. That's because you're making your washbacks quite big. Modern washbacks are made of stainless steel, and there's a lot of conjecture about stainless steel versus wood. The first is the heat problem, because stainless steel radiates heat extremely well, which means it won't overheat and kill the yeast, but it might cool down and slow the fermentation rate down. Wood's much more insulating, but then you do have the battle of you get too warm and start injuring your yeast. You're racing to do this fermentation because there are other things that like the wort. There's other bacteria that want to consume that sugar, and one of the most difficult ones to deal with is lactobacillus, the stuff that makes yogurt. And the lactobacillus bacteria is particularly successful in attacking wort because its byproduct is acidic. So it actually raises the acidity, which cripples yeast. And so you can end up with what they call a sour batch. You sour the wort because lactobacillus has taken the batch, essentially, and it ends up being thrown away. The battle against bacteria is cleaning. And so stainless steel is popular because it's very easy to clean very vigorously, where wood is more difficult to clean. Most distilleries that use wooden washbacks use a high temperature steam, and they will pump very hot steam, pressurized steam into the washback and hold it there for 30 minutes or so, essentially to kill all of the bacteria. There's no evidence that there's flavors of the wood that enter the wort at this time as it's being fermented, just because the wood is reused so much. But there is a discussion about ambient bacteria that do add positive flavors, not lactobacillus. And so lots of distillers have gone back and forth with, when they started removing these wooden washbacks in favor of stainless, that the flavor of the washback changed. Typically, when yeast ferment the wort, they only get up to about 7-8% before the alcohol kills the yeast. In the old days, they would filter that as kind of a raw sour beer they called Joe. And certainly it's part of the tasting process to understand like how your fermentation is going to detect a soured washback before you put it into the stills. And so depending on the distillery, you're finding that some distilleries have even new washbacks are being done in wood, not just for traditional purposes, but they believe in the flavors that come from the wood versus stainless steel. And that leads us to today's distillery and a particular version of their whiskey. This is the Ben Nevis distillery. Now, Ben Nevis is located beside Ben Nevis Mountain, the largest mountain in the UK, a very high mountain. And one of the claims to fame for the Ben Nevis distillery is it takes the highest water source in Scotland at about 900 meters. That it takes this very pure spring water to make their whiskey. The location is in the very far Western Highlands, not far from Oban. The very, very Western Highland area is a little bit different than a lot of the other Highland areas. Highland's quite large. It's on the site of Fort William. Fort William, that original fort was built in the 1600s to manage the Scots, as the English said. It was literally named after William of Orange after the 1688 revolution. So just a reminder, there's been people living in that part of the world for a very long time, but that's where the Ben Nevis distillery is. The original distillery was built by the MacDonald family, famously Long John MacDonald, a 6'4" tall man in the 1800s. Was part of the original distillery. They built a second in 1878, although it only ran for about 30 years before it was shut down. The original distillery continued to function under the MacDonald family until 1941. In 1941, it was sold to a Joseph Hobbs. And Joseph Hobbs is a Canadian who grew up in British Columbia, who was born in the UK, but grew up in British Columbia, lots of Scots in BC. But became a millionaire by bootlegging whiskey to Americans in Prohibition. The Hobbs brothers owned a shipping firm that shipped between the UK and the US and Canada. And when Prohibition came on, they learned to take whiskey. Famously, they bought thousands of cases of Teacher's Highland Cream and then ran it in their ships around to California, where people weren't expecting whiskey to land, and the ship would lay offshore, and then speedboats would come and pick up the case of whiskeys and bring it into the local bootleggers. And when Prohibition finally ended, and this enterprise was going to wind down, they took that money and they started buying distilleries. And that's originally they've created a firm called the Associated Scottish Distillers and bought a lot of different distilleries, including Brookladdock. And then it wasn't until that was in the 30s, so after Prohibition was over, it wasn't until 41 that the Ben Nevis distillery got bought. Hobbs shut down the distillery for 14 years. He essentially rebuilt it. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to mention Ben Nevis, because in 1955, when he reopened, he had made concrete washbacks. It was heresy, and yet Hobbs is remembered as a fighter of the small Scottish producer, but he used concrete washbacks and a coffee still. And we'll talk about stills in a later episode because distillation is a complicated process, but a coffee still is a very unusual still for Scottish whiskey. It doesn't make coffee the drink. It's a style of still that does continuous distillation versus batch distillation. He also stuck to making it with his own yeast for a long time. He would blend brewers and distillers yeast, which was, again, considered heresy, and yet he did it for 30 years. The distillery shut down again in 78 and was sold back to the MacDonald family in 81. They took a couple of years to refit it, removing the Nikkei still, and then ultimately shut down again in 86. In 1989, it was sold to the Nikkei company. This is Asahi. This is a Japanese firm that owns a number of Japanese distilleries, and we can talk about Japanese whiskey sometime later. It's a huge story. But this is the only Scottish distillery owned by Nikkei. And in fact, more than half of all the whiskey that Ben Nevis makes goes into blends for Nikkei's blends. When Nikkei took it over, and the funny thing is that Nikkei, being a Japanese distillery, the Japanese distilleries use a lot of coffee stills, but for the Scottish distillery, they remove the coffee still and they remove the concrete washbacks and put in 6 stainless steel washbacks and 2 Oregon pine washbacks. So they use both as part of their process to make their particular whiskeys. The Ben Nevis 10 that I refer to, it's a little bit hard to come by. But if you go looking for Ben Nevis whiskeys, you'll have a tough time. They do a lot of blending. There is their own blend called the Dew of Ben Nevis is lovely and inexpensive. It's very much like a Johnny Walker red or Johnny Walker black. But the 10 is a classic, is a reference version of what they call West Highland whiskeys. It's aged in bourbon casks. And they talk about coffee and chocolate and toffee notes. It's got a lot of color, which comes from the bourbon barrels. They almost talk about a little salty texture to it because it's on the Western Highlands, which gets a lot more ocean exposure. But it's a nice whiskey, and it's like I said, a classic Highland. It's not so rich as the Spays with sherries and ports. It's much more the lighter flavor. And unfortunately, this particular moment, the Ben Nevis Distillery website is in maintenance.
Yeah,
new site
went
coming.
to it. Yeah. Oh well.
And so I linked to one of the popular sellers of Scottish whiskies for the Ben Nevis 10. There are many other editions. Even this 10, depending on its edition, like they say, the 2019 version of the 10 is better than the 2021. But they're all great to drink if you can find them. I would typically only drink a Ben Nevis while I was in Scotland, where it's easier to come by.
And that, my friends, is the story of East Cream and Wort Mash in a nutshell.
Next week on Animal Husbandry, we'll take a look.
Wow.
It does have a... Wow.
So there's fermentation for you.
Yeah.
Now you've got an 8% alcohol solution that you could now add some hops and make it into beer, or we can fire it through a couple of stills
and
make it into whiskey. So next up will be distillation.
It's funny because we spent a lot of time when we were down in Oaxaca with Mike and Amira Elgin visiting mezcal distilleries, and it's a much simpler process.
Yeah.
They don't, it's like once they got alcohol, they go, okay, that's it, we're done.
We're done. Yep, we're done.
Close enough.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing, actually.
That's funny.
And the crazy part is, as whiskeys go, Scottish whiskey is very coherent. You should see how they make Irish whiskey. It can be madness.
Yeah. And a lot of it's not Irish, which is another problem entirely.
Well, their system's a little looser. The Scots are very proud of their whiskey making, and there's very much a culture of the way that they make things.
Right.
The earlier days were obviously more complicated, but since the early stage of 1900s, it's been very consistent product, and it's fun to talk about.
Sure is, and I thank you for the lesson.